The challenge that we have with the growing national debt is it serves, one, to cause great concern among Americans as they wonder what their future will be. And perhaps more importantly, it generates great concern around the world as we live in a global economy from both a business standpoint in particular, but also some of the challenges that our governments face. So this debt issue is not a singular issue of concern just to our country, but to people who look to America for leadership. One of the things that we discussed during the Bowles-Simpson was the timing of making some of these adjustments in spending that obviously need to be made. Timing, I think, is the element. It's not an either-or situation, but it's when do you start making the cuts. And in doing it in a phased approach, addressing some of the very, what I call the ones that we can gain agreement on, like defense and other areas, and then moving forward in more aggressive manners on the cuts, I think positions us for growth in the long term. The other element that we talked about was tax reform. And having served on the tax reform working group for the Fiscal Commission, it was very clear to me in looking at the numbers which we reviewed at each session, that some of the tax expenditures we have are just simply unsustainable. And so a combination of addressing the tax piece as well as the spending cuts, which are very much needed, then positions us, I think, to better position for growth. One of the things that we're challenged by in a global economy is the fact that our tax code is one of the least competitive globally. And so if we can begin to address the tax reform issues, both on the corporate side as well as on personal income tax, I think we can position ourselves and get the growth that is needed to sustain us over the long term. There's absolutely a way to put a deficit reduction plan in that is pro-growth. Again, it's all about timing and sequencing. Right now, we have a huge unemployment challenge that has to be addressed. We need to deal with the joblessness issue. And one of the things that has been put forth in terms of dealing with some of the near-term challenges of helping the jobless find jobs, as well as begin to do some work around infrastructure, which is sorely needed, can be a step one in the movement toward building toward future long-term growth. One of the interesting things that in dealing with this fiscal problem that we have is that the solution is not either or. And the truth of the matter is we do need to generate revenues as well as deal with the need for spending cuts. The revenue generation can be achieved by getting rid of a lot of the tax expenditures that have continued to mushroom over time. So for example, the one that I think most people talk about is the mortgage credit. It clearly states that for homes over $500,000 in cost, that we would look at alternative credits beyond that $500,000 amount, or eliminate it beyond that $500,000 amount. That is a huge step forward in closing a gap that benefits only a few people. One of the things that we've tried to talk about during the context of putting together the plan for dealing with the fiscal challenge is understanding that tax codes need simplicity. In the 25, 30 years, our tax code has just become more and more complicated, creating more and more loopholes. If we just simply simplified the tax code, reduced a lot of the tax expenditures, we could, in essence, reduce the tax rate. And some people just look at any adjustment to tax and say it means more taxes. That's not the case. What it means is that we simplify the rate, we broaden the base from which taxes are collected, we simplify and make more competitive the corporate tax code, and in essence, that brings the other half of the equation, which gives us increased revenues so that when we do take the spending cuts, they're in areas where we can take it and where people don't feel I'm making major give-ups. The important thing is remembering what we as Americans have always been about, and that is about pro-growth, about people having an opportunity to build a business, but also about taking care of those who are less fortunate through no fault of their own. And one of the things that I think sometimes gets lost in the conversation is the importance of doing both. There's no single solution to this. And that's one of the reasons it requires the bipartisan agreement to be able to move this forward and to make sure that everyone makes their own contribution in some way to solving the problem. 60 people, both former people in business and government, have really come out and asked the super committee to think about going beyond the $1.5 trillion cut mandate. The Simpson-Bowles Commission looked at a $4 trillion reduction in the debt. And we did this through a combination of spending cuts along with tax reform. It was work that was spent, a lot of work, a lot of meetings with people to come to the point where, you know, just to cut a few $trillion would not put us on a long-term sustainable path. And that's the thing people need to keep in mind. Making these spending adjustments at this point in time are an important first step, but we really need to have a framework. We need to have a larger framework of understanding where these cuts are going to come from. Otherwise, it's going to feel like you're taking intermittent cuts instead of looking at a total plan and understanding that the size of the spending adjustments will have to be large to have any significant dent in the deficit over the next 10 years. The phrase "go big" has to do with pushing the subcommittee to go beyond their mandated $1.5 trillion cuts to more in line with what several debt commissions have looked at. We've had Domenici-Rivlin, we've had Simpson-Bowles, and several other groups have worked on the same thing. And it's interesting that most of them have come to the need for spending cuts combined with tax reform to give us some incremental revenue. You know, it's interesting in talking with my colleagues while serving on the Fiscal Commission, I think one of the concerns was if we proceed too quickly with ways to generate revenue, that the seriousness wouldn't be taken on the part of the spending cuts. And that's why I think it's really important to think about a go big approach, because in that approach, you're looking at major spending cuts, hopefully at the $4 trillion level, again, which was recommended by many groups, and you counter that with looking at ways to broaden the tax base, simplify the tax code, all of which would lead to incremental revenue. And until we have a comprehensive plan, I think most American citizens, including myself, as well as people around the globe, would look at an incremental approach and say, are they really serious? And I think if you go big, it shows a series of purpose, a seriousness of commitment to really doing what's needed to get ourselves on a sustainable, long-term, fiscally healthy path. Now, the question's been asked about whether the American people would be behind a plan that both parties could come behind. And again, there's no perfect plan for anyone of each party. Everybody has to give something. But isn't that what America's about? Isn't it about us coming together as a community? Isn't it about doing what we need to do to make sure that the future that our children and grandchildren have is going to be better than the one that we had? So I think in this instance, the American public, honestly, is way ahead of our politicians. And we're hoping, I'm sincerely hoping, that through this whole process, that they finally get the message and understand that the American people are smart enough to do the basic math and understand that the answer to this problem is not an either or, but both. In terms of my advice for reaching a deficit reduction plan, it's very simple. All you need to do is look at what's already been done. There's a lot of work that was done by Domenici-Rivlin, by Simpson-Bowles Commission, and the framework is there. And so where you choose to place those priorities and how you choose to sequence them, the answers are there. We have to deal with Social Security. The demographics are such that we need to make adjustments in order that Social Security is there 20, 30, 40 years from now. We need to deal with Medicare and Medicaid. Again, the demographics are pushing us in that direction. And it is not a matter of whether it goes away or how much it's chopped. A measured approach to dealing with the problem is best dealt with before the house is on fire. And we're really close to that point. And sometimes basic human behavior, if you have to make decisions at the last minute, you won't make the best decisions. So now is the time to put together a plan that we can follow, that we can stick with, and that we will support politicians who get behind having a plan of action versus those that hide behind a cloak of ideology.